So maybe I'll just start quickly by introducing myself. I'm Lama Nachman. I am a senior fellow at Intel Labs, and I lead a multidisciplinary human-centered AI lab that's focused on human AI collaboration and responsible AI. I also lead the responsible AI program across Intel. So I guess, what I'm gonna have everyone on the panel introduce themselves. But maybe to just set some context, as I reflect on the last decade of innovation in AI and the different stages that we've been in, starting from when really deep learning was showing us how we can break all sorts of plateaus with bespoke models, to LLMs and foundation models, where we started to really prove out that with larger capacity and innovation in algorithms, you're able to actually show a lot of generalization to all sorts of downstream tasks. And then with adding a natural interface to that, showing that you're able to actually democratize AI and enable everybody to go and explore what they can do with AI. So taking it out of maybe the world of the AI developers to everyday users who can actually explore interesting usages. And that has shown us a lot of interesting applications and usages in all sorts of domains. But at the same time, from the discussion this morning and from all the work that you're all doing, it was clear to all of us that there are a lot of ethical risks that were coming out throughout that decade. And those ethical risks shifted a bit as the capabilities of these AI systems were actually improving. And as a result, we really have put together as a community a lot of work in coming up with responsible AI frameworks, methods, technologies to be able to both assess and mitigate that risk. So now, as we transition into the agentic AI world, it's really interesting to think about this whole capability of increased autonomy, of being able to learn from these interactions with users and with other AI agents, and in being able to really just automate a complete task and workflow and all of that, where ROI starts to actually look interesting. At the same time, we would expect a lot of new risks to emerge and perhaps start to challenge a lot of the responsible AI frameworks that we have built with the assumptions that we've had on the type of capabilities that exist. So I will start with having each of you introduce yourselves and maybe quickly talk about how do you define agentic AI and how do you see it different from where we are right now with Gen AI. So Ruchika, maybe I'll start with you.
Thanks, Lama. Hey, everyone. I'm Ruchika. I lead the AI agents portfolio at the Center for Democracy and Tech. And we have been thinking about agents, from the perspective of really thinking about it as a property that AI systems have. And so thinking about agenticness on a spectrum. And the way that we're conceptualizing it, and it seems like this is the direction things are headed, is really thinking about an AI system that can take a very high-level goal, produce a plan to execute steps needed to achieve that goal while using external tools and have the ability to adapt as situations change. And so it's helpful to think about this as like AI systems being able to do more complex things in more complex environments, as opposed to here's an agent or here's something that's not an agent. So that's how we've been thinking about it, but curious about the other experts here.
Nathan.
Hey, yeah, I'm Nathan Lambert. I'm a researcher at the Allen Institute for AI here in Seattle, where I'm one of the leads on our open language modeling effort, mostly for post-training. And I think agentic AI really goes back to decision-making rather than making predictions generally. And that's related to reinforcement learning, which a lot of the culture came from for agentic AI. And today it's kind of getting rehashed in the lens of generative AI. So for the case when we're actually using these models that are generating new content, I would say that anything that is generating tokens that have that are kind of pushed out and have impact on the world in some way. So that can be tools, it can be more content, it can be lots of different things, would be classified under what people are referring to as an AI agent today. But I think what Ruchika is saying is kind of like a goal for where we should get to. So it's kind of a difference between the discussion and what I actually think should be reserved for the term AI agent. And I'm sure we'll touch on that.
Yeah, for sure. And William?
Yeah, William Bartholomew, Director of Public Policy in the Office Responsible AI at Microsoft. I think it's really interesting because for each of these technologies, we always start off with the definitions question, and it's never as easy as it seems. And in fact, I've found even with internal audiences, talking to, whether I'm talking to, for instance, the research team that wants a very precise definition where each characteristic is very precisely defined, through to a marketing team that wants to call everything an agent because that's the cool thing, and then there's this kind of middle ground of, okay, well, what's the pragmatic, particularly from a policy perspective, thing that we can kind of say, okay, well, do we have to treat this differently? And I think that's really what we're looking for in a definition, which is, when do we need to treat this thing differently to some other AI system? I've been recently working with the AI Governance Alliance at the World Economic Forum on a paper they're doing on agentic systems, where they've adopted, I'll say, an extension of the ISO definition of AI agent, which basically says, it's an AI system that operates with some level of autonomy in an environment and can percept things from that environment and take action within that environment. And I think the kind of one of the interesting things there is also, what is the definition of environment? And they wanted a definition that would cover both physical agents that were embodied and could operate in a physical environment, but they also recognize that we are moving into an era where there's going to be more digital agents, and the virtual environment is as important.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting that you're saying this because, a lot of that debate, sometimes the question is to what end, right? And what are we trying to do with that definition, to the point that Nation mentioned. But also when we talk about, physical versus virtual, it's also really interesting to think about that in terms of it inhabits the physical world, or is it actually also embodied in the physical world and acts in the physical world, right? Because we're talking both about like the understanding and the action. Okay, so maybe let's step back and you touched on this whole notion of what is now and what is in the future and where these things, we define them to be today. So, when I kind of think about AI usages that are enabled by agentic AI, clearly we've seen it kind of come up in all sorts of domains, right? From customer support to HR. Pretty much any flows that require a lot of manual things that can be supported by all sorts of services. You could imagine an AI agent that can, or work with other AI agents that can orchestrate a lot of that, right? And I am, at the risk of sounding like I'm extremely shallow, one that I really want to see is actually a travel agent that can, I love traveling, and something that can completely go figure out, help me explore where I want to go, where I want to stay, and then figure out exactly how to personalize to the things that I feel are not necessarily very typical in what you would do if you aggregate across recommendations, but truly understanding who I am and figuring out when to pull me in to ask me the questions. So maybe, Nathan, since you kind of talked about the now and then, can you maybe talk about a few usages that you think are enabled by agentic AI as we see it today, but also as you see it progress over time?
Yeah, so I've started using the term in my brain for like orchestration systems for what the AI agents that we have today are. So like something like the new Siri that's supposed to be an Apple Intelligence that we don't have yet, that you call upon your phone to do a couple things between apps and take some basic action for you, which is very much marketed as an agent, but I think in a few years that won't be really thought of as an agent, and it'll be more of something where it's like, as a researcher, I will ask a AI system to be like, find me the first paper that used this term in my area that kind of defined it. And it can go on its own and work with Google or other knowledge stores or potentially send emails and then come back to me with an answer. That's a very much a different workflow than like an active versus a passive one. And I think we're going to start working with these things, and your travel agent will be something that works like next year, but these more open-ended things that is tied to a lot of the narratives from like these frontier AI labs that say all these things about autonomy. It's like the things we'll have versus the things that were kind of like science fiction. And I don't know how to bridge the gap.
Ruchika, so what do you think is science fiction and what do you think is actually possible?
Well, this talk is recorded, so it'll go down in history as to what my prediction was. But I think the travel agent sounds pretty attractive, and I do see us moving in the direction of that. My sense for like the vision is, you know, thinking about maybe a really smart like colleague that you're working with that just like enhances the way you think about a problem, can give you other perspectives on it, and then potentially can take part of the project or like the product and work on it and sort of, you know, come back to you with it. I see like a lot of folks talk about that imagination of where these agentic systems could go. I say that with a lot of, you know, caveats that getting there is going to be a challenging and difficult path, and it's going to matter the choices that we make in getting there, whether that's, you know, an exciting place to be or, you know, a complete dystopia where we feel, you know, as a collective really disempowered by the systems that we see.
Yeah, that's a great point. William, what do you think is possible?
At this point, I'll just say I think everything's possible at some point. I think one thing that's kind of really interesting about agents is I think one of the things that really differentiates them is the ability to be, you know, asynchronous or reactive. And so not necessarily kind of reacting to a direct direction like at a specific point in time, but being able to observe and work out when an action needs to be taken, or to be able to be given a task, go off and kind of proactively kind of drive that. And so I think this reactive versus kind of directed activity, synchronous versus asynchronous, is going to be, I think, one of the steps that will differentiate, for instance, a chatbot customer service agent from what I think we're talking here about as an agent. And then I think we'll see kind of the next evolution, which is the multi-agent, which kind of takes that to another scale again.
Yeah, and I think, you know, this whole promise of a multi-agent, you know, system that's able to orchestrate, negotiate, do all of these things from different perspectives, whether it's from a user's perspective or from our organizational perspectives, actually kind of really, I think, where a lot of that struggle is going to come with through these negotiations. Okay, so I guess as we think through these capabilities now and in the future, you know, I can imagine that there will be a new set of risks that emerge that will start to challenge the responsible AI frameworks that we've built and have been evolving over time. I mean, I can't imagine that having multiple agents that are going, you know, into the wild and doing all sorts of things and having access, because they have been granted access, right, to all sorts of services and capabilities to be able to do things on our behalf, that, you know, we can even start to understand where all the risks that are going to happen, especially in the you know, in any context, in a context of even a specific usage or application. And one of the things I worry about is actually, you know, that human ability to actually have the oversight of these AI agents, because every time we talk about AI, we talk about human oversight. But the level of complexity that we're going to see if these things happen is, to me, worries me about the human's ability to actually do that oversight. So maybe I'll start with you, William. So what do you see as, you know, these new risks that, you know, we really need to be paying attention to, and how do you see us kind of evolving these responsible AI frameworks to be, you know, better suited for addressing these risks?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's both new risks and also changes to how we assess and mitigate existing risks. One step that we've kind of taken as we've been looking at this within our policies is we have our responsible AI standard that breaks down principles into goals and requirements, is going through those and looking at, okay, for an agentic system, how does this need to be adapted? And so to your question of human oversight, one of the goals of agents is to not necessarily require as much human oversight, but how do you then identify what are the points where an agent needs to have that human oversight? What is that trigger that allows you to still get the benefits of it being able to operate with autonomy, but still be responsible and be safe? And so working out what are those criteria, I think as we go through each of the different kind of requirements, I think that's going to be one of the key questions, which is how do we adapt this for that environment?
Nathan?
I have kind of a different direction to go, so I wasn't going to jump in fast, but I'm in like fine-tuning language models in this post-training thing. We can see that there's a lot more control that we have on the outputs, and we can do that, and you can kind of document your intentions versus what actually happens. And I think when it comes to agents, there's kind of a gap between agents that we're talking about with a specific task. So like the travel agent should give you an itinerary and you say yes, no on buy or so on. But there's also the reality that people will give agents like a high level direction and just put them out on the web, where it's like, I will just have an agent running to reply to people that ask questions about my research or blog. But if there's no kind of return or specific outcome, it's a lot harder to create norms on like what is good or what is bad. I think a travel agent that goes wrong and like spends too much money or does something that impacts a third party, I think is a lot clearer to make guidelines on like what was actually like potentially negligent versus just someone like having an agent for fun that does stuff on the internet. It's just really open-ended, and try to draw lines on how norms and any oversight is drawn there.
So I guess you're saying having the ability to actually understand better what the outcomes are and being able to close loop on those to figure out how to further improve those is needed. And if we're putting something out there into the world, not necessarily understanding its impact on others too, right? Because that's the problem. It's like usually we're talking about multi-agent interaction. Even I wonder about our ability to understand the impact of, these actions.
Yeah, it's mostly to say that when if it has an outcome that is the goal, it'll be a lot easier to study and understand the systems, whereas if it's just like a open-ended problem.
And Ruchika?
Yeah, agree with much of what has been said. I think every time we talk about risks regarding any new technology and, recently AI systems, there's all these questions of like, what does human oversight mean? How are we going to govern these agents? And I think it's worth teasing apart what is new and what has already been done. And so, much of the risks that we see with LLM outputs of like bias, et cetera, are going to continue. But at the same time, taking a step back, we may not know exactly how to pursue, these risks and like mitigating these risks, but we do know how to, take good decisions in the face of uncertainty. And I think much of those ideas should continue to apply to risks. And so when we come across like new risks, for example, there's this idea of like, who is the agent serving, or like whose interests are being served? And the answer like no longer is just the user, right? Like that's a very straightforward thing that we were seeing with AI systems earlier. But let's say you have a shopping agent, and you have a shopping agent and everyone else has a shopping agent. And let's say these agents collude, and then you have prices that are bad for consumers at large. And so I think the fact that these agents are doing more complex things means that the goals, how we define them, is going to matter. The fact that they're doing it in more complex environments bring a new set of risks as to like what multi-agent coordination looks like, what happens when agent starts delegating their tasks. So I think there are some risks that continue and are exponentially exacerbated. There are some new risks, but I do want us to be confident in our ability to take good decisions when we don't know or like have high uncertainty about what the outcomes can potentially look like.
Yeah, and that's a great point. But I guess to take this further, do you think that we're well set up with our existing frameworks and policy systems and things like that to deal with that? Or do you see fundamentally the approach that we've taken in responsible AI needs to change in any way?
I think we have to do more. I think everyone in this room would potentially agree with that. And I think we need to do more. We need to do what we have done better. And I think it starts with a shared understanding that this is a hard problem. At CDT, we work closely with folks in the industry, policymakers, and it's almost always like, everyone's like, tell us what's the right way to do this. And so I think this recognition across, different stakeholders that it's not that, companies are doing bad things. It's like they really want to get it right, but this is a hard problem. And the same recognition on the other side of like, well, if you want to build safe systems, you have to have, if you want to build safe AI, products, you have to have governing mechanisms that encourage that. And so, as a hint towards companies to also work with regulators as to like influence what a good, healthy ecosystem can look like that makes it safe, but also, allows the benefits to be distributed equitably.
So speaking of that and of frameworks, so I'm sure you're all familiar with this because you've contributed to the framework on the classification of agents that PAI has been working on along with their partners. And what I found interesting about that framework is that it kind of extends this notion about the risk and the mitigation strategies beyond the agent capabilities to look at the context of use and the context of deployment, as well as thinking about the affordances of these interaction mechanisms between humans and AI agents. So I was curious about any of you who wants to chime in on how do you see such a classification framework being utilized, and then maybe what type of criteria do you think of when you think about AI agents that you think would be helpful in a classification framework for the purpose of being able to do better assessment and mitigation?
I think the purpose of classification is really to bring a level of simplicity and consistency. And so as I was talking about earlier, there'll be all of these different characteristics, but within those characteristics, there'll be clumps of them that tend to have the same levels of risk. And so by kind of simplifying, some of these clusters of, hey, if something has this combination of things, it is this type of thing, and here is typically the set of risks and the appropriate mitigations. That just allows, rather than having to do the assessment across each of those characteristics every single time, it can bring a level of simplicity to that. I think we also do need to be careful of, sometimes you can oversimplify, and that might hide a nuance that is important. And so I don't think it absolves of, thinking about risk more broadly, but it does provide a really good kind of first level categorization of, oh, this is something that interacts with the physical world, it's operating machinery, so there is going to be a set of physical risks I need to worry about here, versus the shopping agent where, I might be worried about how much it's going to run up my credit card.
Good point. Any other input on the classification
I think
framework?
it's the right start. I mostly think that now and the next year is to see examples of these AI agents, and then especially things where we can see the full context of what is happening behind the scenes when you tell it to do something. So like what parts of the web are actually interfaced with, and then with examples we can probably make a more useful taxonomy from there, because a lot of this is like we're trying to wait and see what's coming, but we know it is so big that we're trying to get ahead of it. So you kind of have to just continue and adapt.
Anything on your end?
I'll just add that I think one of the things that can, be a benefit of such classification is to root them in where the product landscape is today, because there is a tendency to either operate in diminishing the risks or like the capabilities, or go to these like AI coaches or chiefs of staff. But a classification framework like the one PAI is building allows us to like really ground ourselves into like what exists and what is predicted to exist in the near future, both from a capabilities perspective and a deployment context perspective. And I think that can really help us iteratively develop the right tools for safe deployment of these technologies.
Okay, so I'm gonna just have you all think about the questions, because I still have a couple of questions for the panel, but please start thinking about what your questions are, because I promised I will end exactly with 10 minutes of Q&A. Okay, so maybe, when we're looking at, a landscape that is moving so fast, right, and technology that's moving so fast, and we're trying to, at the same time, see all of these policies and frameworks that are being enacted, it makes it really hard for policy and governance to actually happen in that fast-moving space. So I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts about how could industry and regulatory bodies work together to actually come up with policy that is both adaptable and enforceable at the same time.
I think one of the things here is making sure policy is focusing more on the outcomes than the implementation. And I won't name names, but I was reviewing some draft legislation recently where it was saying, computer system, and they were adding or artificial intelligence system. Like, that's actually not really helping, because an AI system is just a computer system. It would have been covered by the existing legislation. And what I would hate to see is that now say AI system or AI agent or whatever comes next. And I think, the conversation between industry and regulators can help find language that is sufficiently broad to cover future scenarios, but also narrow enough that it is actually accessible, enforceable. And I think that discussion is where we can make legislation that is more robust to future change.
And I guess that reminds me of the discussion earlier on the disability part, right?
Yes.
Which actually resonated quite a bit. Any other input on that?
Yeah, I think, again, I bring this point back because I think we're at a pivotal place where this shared understanding of just how hard the problem that we're trying to solve is between industry and policymakers can go a long way in facilitating trust to actually solve this problem together. And I think, through like collaborative efforts and through, making sure that industry does what industry does best and regulators do what regulators do best can be a good approach. One example of that is that, in the agents discourse, it's going to be really important for us to have visibility into what the agents are doing, when they're doing it, and how they're doing it. And this is where, and by this I mean like technical visibility into like the activity logs that you have for agents or agent identifiers, that piece, but also, some form of like institutional visibility. And I think that is where like industry can really like, set the norms for what is possible. The flip side, or the other side of the bargain, if I may call it that, is that regulators have to grapple with this new reality that is like a lot more complicated than what we've witnessed before, and find the right balance of setting up systems that make sure like people, someone is incentivized to be accountable for a certain set of harms. Like someone should be incentivized to be like looking out for things that could go wrong. But at the same time, making sure that that accountability is both, falling on people who have the ability to do it, to, mitigate these risks, and the resources to mitigate these risks. And within that, how do you create a climate of, getting some of these things wrong, but really fixing them very quickly, iteratively, and getting them right is going to be the big challenge.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly I think I would say that in the responsible AI domain, what I've seen from a community participation perspective, and definitely with efforts from PAI and multi-stakeholder engagement, is that there seems to be a much more collaborative approach to actually really uncover the problems and put them out there and understand how do we actually all kind of work together as a community to solve them. So I really hope that we continue on down that path. Okay, so maybe just rapid fire, because we have exactly 4 minutes. What do you see as like your biggest hope of what agentic AI would turn into, things that it would enable if we do these things right? And what would keep you up at night if you don't do this right? And maybe I'll start quickly with one that's very dear to my heart, which is my hope is that agentic AI could really help dramatically with enabling people with disabilities to actually have a voice. So a lot of the work, remembering back a lot of the work that I've done with Professor Stephen Hawking, it was very obvious to me that automating a lot of actions so that things are not actually happening at the transaction level, but are happening at the intention level or the overall flow, were the things that enabled the most impact in terms of being able to be independent and have a tool like this to do that. Of course, we had to go build all of that out from scratch because we didn't have agentic AI at the time, so we had to kind of do things that took forever. So this whole notion of like agentic AI, to me, that's my biggest hope. But then on the other side, of course, it could end up bringing way more inequity if we don't do it right. So I'll start with you.
All right, I'm going. Again, I think the hope is really transform the capabilities for humans. Can we do a whole new set of things because now more creative pursuits are available to us. I think that is the hope. I'd love a travel agent. I want to come back to that. That would make my life much easier. But I think on the way to that, what really also keeps me up at night is what is the transition going to look like? What are some of the displacements that this is going to cause? Are the benefits going to be equitably realized? And I think Eric raised this question earlier in the day, which is what does it mean to be human? As decision making is something that gets transformed. And so how do we ensure that this is taking us towards a collectively empowered place would be the thing that I'll at least go back home and think about today.
Nathan.
Yeah, great. I could start with my worry, which is somewhat similar, and then go to the hope. I have a general worry, as you were talking about this transition, is that before these kind of frameworks and understanding for agents are established, that there's kind of big, not even necessarily anti-AI backlash, but some minor AI disaster happens, and we could see this framed in many things, like cyber infrastructure or something. And then that type of incident that's bound to come severely changes the trajectory of technology and who is involved in things like that. So that's just what we're getting ahead of. And a hope to be able to avoid some of the stuff is that things like open source infrastructure for AI agents get built in a really strong way. They don't exist that well right now, and that would give us this transparency into this new technology that we're all talking about, and to understand how they work rather than being behind an API call that you don't see what happens. William,
final word.
Yeah, it's a hard question to go last in, especially after a Stephen Hawking reference. But I think one of the fundamentals of problem solving is kind of divide and conquer. And I think agents really give us an opportunity to take that idea of divide and conquer into this AI world. And so I see that there's a potential for potentially solving some of the complex problems that are facing society at all levels, and agents being able to enable that. I think one of the fears is that, as we look into these kind of more dynamic agent ecosystems, being able to manage them and constrain them and ensure that they aren't causing unexpected harms is going to be one of the important things as we kind of give them more and more power to be able to go solve these problems.
All right. So with that, we'll turn to your questions. Who is running mic?
And
Thanks, Steph.
folks, as you ask questions, please remember to introduce yourself and your organization.
I'm Claire. I don't know if I'm allowed to ask questions, but I work at PAI. I was struck by two aspects of the conversation. One, this implication that we need better monitoring to see what's happening in the real world with agents. And another about potential unintended consequences. So I'm curious what you all think about the monitoring idea of having there be proof of personhood on the web so you could know that a certain individual is behind agents. And if you've thought about that, because there was a paper from OpenAI and others, and I was actually on it about just thinking about personhood infrastructure. And second, what do you think about some of the privacy implications of the monitoring regimes? I ask because a lot of watermarking is being proposed, and at least in our synthetic content work, as Sam was talking about, there's so many implications of tracking where content comes from. The same can be said in agentic systems. So I guess, what do you think about these personhood questions? And then that brings up privacy and expression trade-offs. Huge questions.
I would say that I think more about transparency than monitoring. So I think monitoring as a required oversight, and transparency as access to information that you don't necessarily build new bodies to look at it. So that kind of should hopefully avoid some of the scary words on monitoring. And then your comments on personhood, I generally think that we're going to move towards a validated human content, or validated that you are a human, and then most everything else will be assumed that it is AI generated or an agent. And I don't know how we're going to do much better than that. I think it's going to be hard to have platforms to be like, you have N agents associated with this one account. I just don't expect to get there. So it's kind of a practical solution.
It's interesting actually to think about the personhood in the context of the accountability of AI agents. I really have not actually thought about that link before but that's actually a really interesting question. I will ponder on that.
Hi, my name is Brian. I'm here. I'm with Airbnb, but this question isn't particularly related to my job. I was worried that it was going to be too philosophical, and then I heard your question. So, so I like to think about agents specifically as being contextualized. It's really useful to use people as an analogy for them, right? To think of them as though you would think of another human, because that's what we're trying to model them after, right? And one of the things that came up a lot in your discussion was a lot of fears around control. Like, once these things are developed, will they go out and do this or that or this or that? And I work in industry, I work with AI, I've done AI prototypes, and I find that the leadership in our companies tend to be either all in or all out. They are really, really excited about making that agent, and then as soon as anything goes wrong, they just shut it down. And I wonder whether this panel has any thoughts on how we could move from a fear-based control model to an enablement model, kind of like what Ruchika was talking about, where you could treat these agents kind of like you treat interns, where you're setting them up in a sandbox environment with controls and allowing them to build responsibility, rather than trying to make an agent that is going to plan your entire travel agent trip, and if anything goes wrong, you'll never use it again. So.
Thank you for answering your own question. No, no, I think you're 100% right there. That I think there's actually a lot we can learn from, for instance, the cybersecurity domain here, where it's really about constraining the environment around the agent rather than the agent itself. And there's a saying in like a lot of the operations thing, like if the intern can break the system, the mistake is the system, not the intern. And I think that same kind of thinking here, which is make sure that the agent is operating in an environment that it is safe for the agent to operate in. Still build safety into the agent, but you also need safety around the agent. And I think, yeah, if we can bring those same concepts to agentic AI, I think that's the way to go.
I'll just add to that, and maybe this goes to both questions. I think we also might need to reimagine what control looks like. And I say this in the context of, let's say, human oversight, right? A lot of the conversation around human oversight has been very like human in the loop. And I use this as an example to say that maybe like it's gonna get very hard to have a human in the loop in a system that is essentially trying to, work more independently of a human. And so in that context, for us, the question to ask is, what does effective oversight in this situation look like? And that then opens up the conversation to potentially other ways of feeling like you're in control of the situation. One example is that as a human, I potentially don't want a new AI system or an agentic AI system to constrain the choices that I had before it was introduced in a way that I had no say over. Or I want to make sure that I don't get deceived by this AI system. And so if we start thinking about, okay, what can we do to enable these aspects of feeling in control, feeling like this is working for us? I think then moving to the technical bits of, let's say, how important is clearly stating personhood in this particular situation going to be? Or, when we talk about control, what aspect of control do we want to solve for the most? So I think there is a need to reimagine some of these concepts, and we've seen that through the discussions today. How that can be done in different domains.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, in some sense, you did answer your own question, but I think the thinking about what are the mission critical scenarios that, I would say that I've seen this in AI and Gen AI even ahead of agentic AI, right? Because when we worry about control, in many cases, what's underlying that worry of control is one of accountability. So the question that you really need to answer is, when we are trying to make decisions that are mission critical and have ramifications, and things don't go the right way, who is accountable? And whoever is perceived to be accountable, how would a level of oversight enable that person to be more comfortable with that technology coming in to enable those decisions to be made? And I've seen that in manufacturing day in and day out. Like we run through this even ahead of agentic AI. We've had the same problem with trying to integrate AI into the flows that are very mission critical. Other questions? I still have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Thank you. I'm curious, a lot of what you described as agents and orchestration systems are performing work in the travel agent context, right? Along a set of work and things that we know to do. I'm curious if you guys have seen agents as opening up possibilities for new types of work, what that means and how we think about what's ahead. I guess a maybe banal example is somebody said something about the next fully AI agent $100 million business is sometime in the next 5 years, right? You could build a whole company around a set of agents. running a drop ship business, right? So I'm curious if there are new types of work that you see coming out of what the potential agents offer and what that means for how we think about human AI interaction.
I have a non-answer, but that's pretty much asking the same question of like, we know AI is extremely powerful, but we don't know what we're going to use it for, and that is a large source of the excitement. So I agree.
So I guess maybe one thing that I would say, I mean, if you think about what makes it much more tractable to do AI agents today, is the fact that we have tons of services that we can digitally control. And what has been missing is that humans have been playing the role of an agent that orchestrates all of these access to these different services. So I think logically, there's a lot to be leveraged in the existing infrastructure and services that exist, and to build on top of these, which naturally will tend to look like a lot of things that we do today. We just do way, more efficiently, and because of that lack of, human agent that is needed to manually do these things. Probably you'll see a lot of that, because anything else will require building a lot of that other infrastructure of new things that we have not imagined how to do in the past. But that's why I think that's what we tend to see today as a lot of examples of these. All right, so I guess we are done. I see a 0 and a flashing. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been amazing.
Thank you.